What I was doing early on when I was hearing these reports were interpreting them, calling them psychological or brain chemistry aberrations or whatever. That there was a part of the brain that was being dinged that was responsible for the alien appearance phenomenon.
Greetings. My name's Rick Strassman. I live in New Mexico, and I'll be presenting some information and ideas regarding psychedelics and DMT today. I want to thank the organizers for the Default Mode Network lecture series, Christopher and Amy. I will screen share with a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll kind of fade into the corner and be back at the end of the slides. And feel free to email me, check out my website. The PowerPoint presentation is available for download too. So, let's go right into it. So psychedelic drugs affect all components of consciousness, not only one or two elements, like, for example, the stimulants or the sedative hypnotics. They affect mood, thinking, perception, body awareness, sense of self, self-control. Stimulants only modify energy, mood. Sedatives induce sleep and reduce anxiety. So I studied DMT mostly. So this talk will emphasize that molecule. It's a relatively small structure, not much larger than glucose or blood sugar. It was first synthesized in Canada by Mansky in the 1930s, but was never studied. Then it was discovered in psychedelic plants in Brazil in the 40s and the 50s by both Brazilian and US chemists. Even though it was isolated from those compounds, it wasn't determined to be psychedelic. And so the psychedelic effects of DMT in humans was first determined a few years into the 1950s. And the story is interesting. Stephen Jarrah is a psychiatrist and a chemist who was in Hungary at the time, and he wanted to study LSD. But because Hungary was at that time behind the Iron Curtain, he couldn't obtain any. So he went to the library, learned about DMT, and made some in his laboratory. He tried taking increasingly large oral doses without effect, and then injected himself intramuscularly and discovered its psychedelic properties. At first, it was an obscure compound, kind of weird, short-acting, and it really didn't pick up until it was discovered to be naturally synthesized in mammals, including humans. So there were a handful of human DMT studies after its discovery during the first wave of human research. There wasn't any psychotherapy research as compared to, say, LSD, which was used quite often in psychotherapeutic studies. The main interest in it was because of its being endogenous. It was discovered in mammalian lung, mammalian brain. So people became interested in whether it was abnormally produced in naturally psychotic conditions like schizophrenia, for example. The simplistic way of describing those studies was perhaps there was more DMT made in the brain of schizophrenics as compared to normals. The ability to measure DMT back then and even nowadays is quite limited because concentrations are very low. And so when these studies ended in early 1970s, the conclusions weren't really that definitive. Also, there was an interest in developing an anti-DMT. Perhaps it would have anti-schizophrenic effects. So the theory basically went that DMT produced hallucinations, more or less, visions and voices, alteration in body sensation, sense of self, and so did people with naturally occurring psychosis. And so, to the extent that those two syndromes overlapped, there might be some common biology that could be either useful for understanding the disorder and or treating it. So when these studies with humans ended in the early 1970s with the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, studies in basic science continued, mostly with LSD in rodent models, animal models. And that work helped define the different subtypes of serotonin receptors, which were exploited to develop the new generation of antidepressants, like like Prozac came straight out of serotonin research, which really sped up after the discovery of LSD, because LSD modifies serotonin receptors. So we now know that the receptor that all of the classical psychedelics affect is the serotonin 2A at the postsynaptic site. And there's a little bit, and there's some downstream effects of glutamate. There probably are some other serotonin receptors that play a role. And the models were behavioral and neuroendocrine in the animal models. You give an animal LSD and then you give it a new compound, and if it responds as if it were given LSD, you can suggest that the new compound is like LSD. But the gold standard is to give the compounds to humans for them to be able to characterize. So basic, advances in the basic sciences, especially with respect to DMT, has mostly been going on at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And there was a 2013 paper demonstrating DMT in the living rodent pineal gland. I speculate at the end of my DMT book that perhaps the pineal makes DMT. And then a couple of years ago, the same group published some data on the synthesis of DMT in rodent brain. And concentrations were comparable to those of the canonical neurotransmitters, like serotonin and like dopamine. So there is an increasing amount of data that's pointing towards the possibility of a DMT neurotransmitter system, which would be quite interesting. Also in the 2019 studies, they induced cardiac arrest in the animals, and brain levels increased quite a bit, especially in the visual cortex. The pineal DMT story is still a bit murky. The more recent study wasn't able to demonstrate measurable levels of DMT in pineal, so the jury is still out. So let's get back to the clinical world. One of the motivations for my DMT study was to understand the biology of naturally occurring altered states, especially spiritual ones brought on by meditation. But the same idea applies to other non-drug altered states with psychedelic characteristics or psychedelic properties. Dreams, psychosis, as we mentioned, the near-death state. And I suggested that there was a common biological denominator. In other words, if you gave LSD and you had some visions and you meditated in a certain manner and you had the same kind of visions, then perhaps the same biological process is going on, activated by either LSD or by the meditation. And if there were a naturally occurring compound with psychedelic properties, then you could focus on that as being elevated in the meditative states, the near-death states, and so on. So I started planning my psychedelic drug research in 1972 when I was 20 years old. But because of my interest in studying psychedelics, I was rejected by 19 of the 21 medical schools I applied to. So I kept my interest to myself for the next 10 to 12 years. Went to medical school, became a psychiatrist, trained in clinical psychopharmacology research. And I knew if I was going to study psychedelics in humans, I would need to counter the first reaction, which would be these drugs are dangerous. They can't be used safely in clinical research. So in anticipation of that objection, I wrote a paper on the adverse effects of psychedelic drugs, which reviewed hundreds of papers, case reports, case series, and concluded that if you screen volunteers carefully, supervise their experiences closely, follow the volunteers, the research subjects up carefully after their study, the incidence of adverse effects is very, very low. And basically, if you're careful, you can do these kinds of studies. So you guys are undergraduates. Once you get into the research world, one thing I recommend is to write a review paper, and then you'll become an instant expert in the field. And with the publication of this review paper, I was able to establish some credibility in the field. I started off, though, looking at the pineal gland because there were some data back then indicating that melatonin was potentially psychedelic. And I thought, well, if we can establish that melatonin is psychedelic, then my search for an endogenous compound which produced psychedelic effects would be over. And so in the mid 1980s, we ran an exhaustive study of the acute effects of melatonin in humans. This was in an endocrinology journal. My mentor was a pediatric neuroendocrinologist. So I was interested in endocrinology, and the brain is an endocrine organ, secretes all these different hormones by means of the pituitary. So that was the approach that I was taking. So melatonin turned out to be only sedating, so I pivoted to trying to get a study of DMT off the ground. I had learned about the existence of DMT about halfway through my melatonin study. It occurred in the human body, was quite psychedelic, and had been studied safely in humans previously. So it was a 2-year process to get permission to do my study. It was the first new human research in the US in 20 years. And, the FDA and the DEA just didn't really know how to handle it because of the communication required between both of those enormous agencies. So I described that process in this uh, in this article. It's what I like to refer to as my what if I'm hit by um, a bus paper. In other words, I wanted to spell out how to do this kind of work, or at least how to get permission uh, as a legacy, as it were. So if anything happened to me, at least it would be written down and other groups could follow. So the main problem was that I couldn't possess DMT until FDA gave the go-ahead that it was a safe study to do. But FDA wouldn't give me the go-ahead until I had the DMT and could subject it, to the necessary quality control. So I won't bore you with the details, but trust me, it was pretty stressful. But finally, we could get started. It was interesting. I had two grants even before getting the compound in my hands. So there was interest. It had been so long since human studies had taken place that I got funding first time around from both NIH and from private funds. The study was just basically a clinical psychopharmacology study. I wasn't doing psychotherapy. I wasn't inducing mystical experiences. Um, I just, wanted to establish that you could do a human Schedule 1 study, and it could be rigorous, done safely, generate valuable data. So there were three perspectives I brought to the grant. One is that it is endogenous, is it playing a role in psychosis, and we need to characterize its effects first in normal volunteers. I also brought up the issue of that people still take psychedelics, and we don't understand their pharmacology very well, especially with respect to all of the animal data that had accumulated over the intervening 20 years. So I kept my goals rather modest. We studied experienced psychedelic users. I believed that experienced folks would be more capable of describing the state and also comparing it to other psychedelics. And also they wouldn't panic in a clinical research unit. So it was a psychopharmacology study. We gave a number of different doses. We didn't do a lot of preparation. In some of the current psychotherapy studies, even the mystical experience studies, there's a lot of preparatory work, 10 to 12 hours. You're educated, you're told what to expect, how to manage the acute effects of the drug, establishment of clinical rapport. There's accoutrements in the room, comfortable furniture, all kinds of things. Buddhist statues. But our study occurred on a busy university, hospital, clinical research center. The preparation was kind of bare bones. I described it as very fast, over quickly. With the higher doses, you may feel as if you've left your body. Don't worry, you're safe. The main goal was to just observe carefully what the state was like, and then to report back to us. We used a fumarate salt of DMT, water soluble. We couldn't have people smoke it, which is the way it's used, mostly in the field, because of the unknown effects on the lung, and it smells bad and people cough. The majority of older human studies gave it intramuscularly, but it wasn't quite the same as the smoked effect, which a couple of our volunteers had experience with. And I started off, giving them an intramuscular dose, and they described it as, not as intense, fast acting as compared to the smoked. And because we were being, funded by the Drug Abuse Institute, I wanted to replicate the abuse, context. We gave a bit, too much in our dose finding work, which, caused confusion and amnesia. And I actually spoke to Stephen Jara, the Hungarian psychiatrist that at first discovered DMT. And I asked him, what happens when you give too much DMT? And he said, people can't remember anything. There's no point in giving those kinds of doses. So we dropped the dose by a third. So we gave low, medium, and high doses, and saline, placebo. The smaller doses were still, psychoactive, but they weren't psychedelic. And we determined a threshold after which effects were uniformly psychedelic. And we determined that both clinically, by the reports of the volunteers at a particular dose, they would say, yeah, now I'm tripping. And at the smaller dose, they would say, well, I feel a little stimulated, a little anxious, I'm a little sedated, any number of things, but they still felt some effects. We also determined the psychedelic threshold dose through our questionnaire, paper and pencil questionnaire. We gave it as a push over 30 seconds, and then we flushed the line. The effects would begin within a few heartbeats, and they wouldn't really, well, and in response to the higher doses, people would be in the midst of it at the end of the flush, 45 seconds after the injection began. So we looked at a slew of biological effects, neuroendocrine things like cortisol, autonomic effects like body temperature, cardiovascular responses like heart rate and blood pressure. Subjectively, the psychological effects, in the beginning, there was quite a rush, an inner feeling of anxiety, acceleration, pressure. And within a minute or so, you would experience the dissociation of your mind and your body, and you'd enter into this world of light, which was full of content with which you interact. Quite frequently, volunteers reported beings or entities or intelligent, sentient, powerful things which could be seen. A bee, a cactus, a robotic type, insects. And even if the location of the intelligence wasn't exactly discernible in a particular figure, it still felt as if the space itself possessed an intelligence. And one of the most striking features of the state was volunteers' descriptions of it being more real than real. I was expecting a particular kind of spiritual experience. I was trained in Zen Buddhism, which emphasizes the attainment of what's called kensho, or satori, or enlightenment. And it's a formless state. It's an empty state. There's no form, feeling, consciousness, perception, or understanding. In other words, there's no body, there's no sense of self, there's no words, there's no perceptions. But only one volunteer had that kind of experience. And he was someone who was a religious studies major in college and always wanted an experience like that, had been involved in a religious organization that emphasized it. So other people just had the kind of experience that was dependent on who they were and what they were hoping for, more or less consciously. One of the volunteers was a nurse with a long-standing interest in the near-death state. She'd been studying it for years, read every book that was out there, and she had a near-death experience. A software designer entered into the platonic world of ones and zeros. So it was a non-specific amplifier of the personality, the psyche, the mind, the more or less conscious aspects of the individual. So it wasn't inherently spiritual, as opposed to my wishful thinking that DMT was pharmacologically spiritual, but you have to be a spiritual person for it to exert spiritual effects. If you're a software designer, it'll manifest programming effects and vice and so on and so forth. So that supports the notion of these drugs being called psychedelic, which is mind manifesting or mind disclosing. Entheogenic, I think, is a bit too narrow. Psychotomimetic is too narrow. It's psychedelic. So the adverse effects were rare, short-lived, and manageable. This despite how carefully we screened people. So even in the best of circumstances, there are going to be some adverse effects. One fellow developed some panic attacks after that overdose, but he got it together and then participated in the full dose response study. A couple of people had recurrences of depression, but responded quickly to treatment, and a couple of people had horrible experiences and dropped out of the study. So we had to keep an eye on them for the presence of post-traumatic stress. We developed a new questionnaire called the HRS, the hallucination rating scale. And it was kind of a meat and potatoes, rating scale. It was, the mechanics, the nuts and bolts of the state, just the components of the mind. And I developed it based on Abhidharma psychology, from Buddhism, which deconstructs ongoing experience into a handful of mental components. And I also combined that approach with the clinical mental status exam that every medical student learns. So it characterized the state. And a number of other questionnaires, oops, I spelled questionnaire wrong, sorry, these other questionnaires tend to be higher order. They're looking at a particular state which comes from a particular theoretical background. Like, for example, the mystical experience questionnaire, which has come out of Johns Hopkins, emphasizes the attainment of a mystical state, which is the model that they're using. If they had given an ego dissolution questionnaire, they would have scored high. If they would have given a schizophrenia scale, it wouldn't be surprising if they scored high as well. So you're kind of boxed into a corner when you're expecting to find with your questionnaire what you expect to find. And in our case, we could make it a little bit more precise. For example, one dose of DMT is visual to this degree, or it's emotional to that degree, or it affects the body to another degree. So I think it's more useful for comparing other drugs, for example, side by side. So the psychedelic renaissance, which is one of the reasons I'm here talking to you all today, it's started with our work, but it took 10 years, 12 years for people to pick up on it, at least in the U.S. Actually, there was a study with mescaline that came out a year before we started our DMT work in Germany. So it began in Europe. but still, we needed to get things off the ground here. The majority of studies all around the world are using either psilocybin, LSD, or ayahuasca, and they're psychotherapy studies for any number of conditions: depression, anxiety, end-of-life despair, substance abuse. Also, there's an increasing amount of data indicating that psychedelics are neurotrophic. They are neuroprotective in conditions of levels of low oxygen in the brain. They stimulate the growth of nerve cells, and they increase the complexity of connections between nerve cells. And also, they've got quite powerful anti-inflammatory effects. So there's an increasing interest in using psychedelics for neurological conditions like stroke and TBI. I mean, think about it, all the contact sports out there, all the people who have strokes, and there really isn't much to do to help them rehabilitate. It could be a real discovery or a real advance in growing new nerve cells, as it were, and repairing connections. So other approaches or other ways in which psychedelics are being used in the Renaissance is what you might call wellness, making good, or making healthy people better. So your meditation improves. You can have religious experiences. The psychopharmacology is being worked out. Which receptors are involved. Brain imaging is being being used quite a bit. To determine the circuitry of what gets activated or turned off after taking psychedelics. And there's a lot of emphasis on the default mode network, which kind of defines us. It's our psyche, as it were, our conscious, unconscious, and preconscious, self-image, habits, those kinds of things. So let's take one slide, I think, for ayahuasca. Yeah. So ayahuasca, I'm sure most of you have heard of. It's a combination of two plants that was developed in the Amazon originally, perhaps thousands of years ago. There's DMT in one plant, and there's a compound which inhibits the monoamine oxidase in the gut, which normally breaks down oral DMT in the other plant. So you've got DMT in one plant, and in the other you have a compound that allows it to become orally active. So it's much slower onset, duration. It's being studied mostly in Brazil and in Europe, and especially in Spain. There's no human research going on with ayahuasca in the US yet. There may be in Canada, but it might be just kind of on the side of academics. So microdosing is a big deal nowadays too. Psilocybin, LSD, and ayahuasca. I think you need to define your terms when you're talking about microdosing. You can use very, very, very small doses without any acute effects, which pharmacologically, if you took it daily, would cause the same brain changes as an SSRI, downregulation of postsynaptic serotonin receptors. And in those individuals, there's descriptions of improved mood. You can use a small dose, slightly higher, which would perhaps be more stimulatory, but still subpsychedelic. You might think a little more quickly, your mood might be slightly elevated. And then even slightly higher, but still subpsychedelic, you would be starting to get a sense of what's in store if you took a little more. So it depends on what you mean by microdosing, and also how often you do it. Is it once a day? Is it once a week?
So DMT has not been studied much in humans, since our work. There was a German paper or a German study, the results of which were published about 10, 15 years ago now. And it was using DMT as a schizophrenogenic compound. And it points to the importance of set and setting. You bring volunteers in to participate in a DMT psychosis study. You give people questionnaires that measure psychotic symptoms, and voila, they score high on psychotic symptoms. And you could say to yourself, and in your publication, DMT mimics certain symptoms of schizophrenia. So the questionnaire, the expectation, all those things go a long way to determine what you see. There's some English studies now happening in London, Chris Timmerman, and he's giving DMT to normal volunteers as well. And he's looking at neural correlates, effects on the default mode network, and the phenomenology, the time course of the experience. So human research, I mentioned Spain and Brazil. The Spanish work is in normal volunteers, brain imaging, psychopharmacology. There are some recent antidepressant, anti-anxiety studies in Brazil, and it seems to work as quickly as ketamine or psilocybin, like within a few hours in a depressed individual. And that probably is the DMT, because if you study DMT in a petri dish, in vitro, you can demonstrate that the neuroplastic effects occur within an hour or two. So the antidepressant effect of an MAO inhibitor, on the other hand, can take a week or two. Also, there's a lot of data demonstrating that if people take ayahuasca in naturalistic settings, retreats, churches, then there seem to be, well, let's see, there's quite a few reports of substantial benefit with mood, quality of life, substance abuse, and the adverse effects are quite rare. So there's a slew of other possible applications of psychedelics that are going to be looked at with the Renaissance. Prisoner recidivism, eating disorders, headache, other kinds of pain, wellness, which we spoke about, sociopathy, autism. There was a paper came out a year maybe ago, 6 months ago, from UCSF demonstrating it's psilocybin is used in group psychotherapy. So if we can keep our noses clean, there's going to be a huge surge in clinical applications. So if you're going to be doing this kind of research and you're reading about it, you want to be careful about screening issues. You don't want to include anyone with a history of psychosis, or probably even a family history of psychosis, especially with the short-acting injectable tryptamines. You want to be careful about cardiovascular disorders, high blood pressure, heart disease, seizure disorder. You probably want to be especially careful before you give someone like that a psychedelic, and what are the medications that they're taking. So there is a question about psychotherapy. The neuroplasticity, folks, think that you can give sub-psychedelic doses, non-psychedelic doses, and still stimulate neurotrophic effects.
So the psychedelic experience, uh, regardless of what you call it, may not be necessary. A mystical experience, DT effect, a flash of insight, working through childhood, trauma. The subjective effects may not be necessary. And on the other camp, uh, 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 emphasizes the importance of attainment of a specific, psychological subjective state. So if it turns out to be the case that psychotherapy is necessary, what kind would it be? There's a group at NYU which is taking an eclectic approach, motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral. The Hopkins group is emphasizing the mystical experience. A study or a group in St. Petersburg, Russia, was giving ketamine for a number of conditions, and their model was aversive. For example, if you wanted to get people to stop smoking, tobacco, you brought them filthy ashtray with butts with all kinds of grimy stuff, and people are tripping, and you have them look at the ashtray and smell it, and oftentimes they would just freak or throw up, or so that's one model. In Canada, in the 1950s, they were treating alcoholics using LSD, and their model was that LSD caused the DTs, short-term DTs. And because a lot of people stopped drinking after the DTs, they figured perhaps that would be curative. And lo and behold, you give LSD, people go through hell and they stop drinking. So it may not be that the specific kind of psychotherapy is important, and psychotherapy may not be necessary at all. So future DMT work. One of the drawbacks of just one dose of DMT is that it's over pretty fast, and by the time you're orienting yourself in that space, you're coming down. So Andrew Gallimore in Japan and I wrote a paper in, I think, 2016 maybe, proposing a continuous infusion of DMT, kind of like anesthesia. And it would be, great for a couple of reasons. One is that it would be a really excellent psychotherapy tool. Because you can go in and out of the state, just turning up or down the dial, because you return to baseline within 15 minutes of the drug being injected. So you can work on things psychologically with your therapist. You could say, I want to go in this deep, or I really want to go for it, or I don't want to go for it for for another half hour or so. And you would have great control over the acute altered state. Also, you could characterize the state much more carefully. You could figure out a better means of interacting with the beings, for example. And in another specific area that I think is especially relevant to DMT is that if it is released in the brain in the dying animal, it may be able to produce a dry run of the near-death experience. So that's probably going to be work that will begin with the terminally ill, perhaps, or even healthy people who want to gain experience with perhaps an NDE-like state before they have to. So 5-methoxy-DMT, either pure, synthesized in the laboratory, or from the venom of a toad, from the Sonoran Desert. It's also endogenous, to mammals, but it's not been characterized as well as DMT. It isn't orally active; it's quite short acting,
It's more typical in producing the white light, the ego, the ego death, formless state, than DMT. It's easy to overdose on, and that's perhaps why people report more frequent flashbacks with 5-methoxy than with DMT. So we were talking about the huge variety of conditions that seem to respond to psychedelics, and that's led me to suggest that maybe psychedelics are super placebos. They are like panaceas. You want this to occur, and this occurs. You don't want that to occur, and that doesn't occur. Enhancement. Sorry, there's another typo. So if that's the case, if the set and the setting, if the person, their intent, why they're volunteering, and the conditions, the circumstances in which they're receiving the drug are so powerful in determining the outcome, then that points to a placebo effect. If that's the case, then conditions that are known to respond to placebo may be especially responsive to psychedelics. Inflammatory conditions, immune conditions, things like asthma, irritable bowel. Depression is quite placebo responsive. Things like cancer, which are not especially placebo sensitive, probably would wouldn't respond quite as robustly. And if it is the case that the placebo effect is going on, and the placebo effect is real, there's all kinds of biological components, concomitants. There's endorphins, there's steroids, there's all kinds of objective measurements which point to an objective effect of placebo. It could be the case that the neurotrophic effects are the ones which would activate the placebo response, the marshaling of the body's innate healing mechanisms, both physiological and psychological. And you may not need a specific subjective experience then. So there's a lot of information that we still need to uncover. So let me veer into spirituality and psychedelics, which is a hot topic. And I think I will pause here for a moment. So spiritual experiences differ. Not all of them are the white light, ego dissolving kind of state. Another kind, which was kind of a description of the DMT experience, could be called interactive and relational. There's content, you maintain your sense of self, you interact with it. And it could occur, and spiritual experiences can take place either within a traditional religious setting or outside of one. But phenomenologically, they are the same. It's just that one might be called Christian and one might be called nature-based, for example. If you're not a spiritual person, or if you're not a religious person, the states on themselves, though, if you gave a questionnaire, would be identical. The interactive relational state, as I mentioned, full of content. You maintain your sense of self. There's a continuation of time and space, even though it's a bit unusual, but still it isn't a timeless moment, or there's no space at all. The certainty of the experience is striking, and that's what's one of the characteristics of the DMT effect as well, which is the sense that what one is witnessing is more real than real.
The mood effects aren't always ecstatic, but usually there's a feeling of awe or reverence, and it's full of information, often verbal, as opposed to wordless. The mystical unitive state, there's a dissolving of the sense of the separate self. It's empty of content. There's merging in unity um, rather than boundaries and interaction. There's a transcendence of time and space. Um, Time stops, space disappears. The one thing they share is the conviction of things being more real than real, and it's nonverbal. The term often used is ineffable. So spiritual experiences can be interactive, relational, or mystical unitive, and they can occur in a religious or non-religious environment. So Buddhism and psychedelics, I mentioned that I've studied, trained in Zen Buddhism. That was the religious spiritual scaffolding I brought to my DMT work. And I had been involved with the Zen community for quite a long time, since my 20s. And because of my interest in meditation and psychedelics, I was curious as to the motivations and the experiences that the monks, the junior monks possessed before they became monks. What kind of psychedelic experiences did they have? Did they have them? And whenever I would get alone with one of the junior monks who were all in their 20s, like I was, I asked them if they had ever taken LSD, and I'd say everyone did. And when I asked them how important their LSD experiences were to becoming a monk, it was important to pretty much all of them. So instead of the unpredictability, the weirdness, the time-limited nature of the drug state, they decided to pursue the vision or the flash of another way of looking and interacting with the world through Zen, Buddhism, monastic life, rather than taking psychedelics. And one of the most important stages in one's Buddhist training is bodhicitta, the first flash of enlightenment. It's the first flash that things are different than how they seem. And that was the effect of LSD, which then prompted these young adults to become monks. And there's also some more current research which demonstrates that in a Zen retreat, psilocybin increases the effects of meditation. So the state of the DMT effect was not the white light Kensho of Zen Buddhism anyway. If I had trained in the Tibetan stream, I may have approached the effects of my DMT work or the results of it differently. It would have been more consistent because there's a lot of visual imagery, visualizations, interaction with spiritual levels of existence in the Tibetan tradition. But there isn't, strictly speaking, in Soto Zen. So I looked for other spiritual models or other religious models, and stumbled upon the prophetic state, as I call it, as described in the Hebrew Bible. Most people think of prophecy as foretelling or predicting, but that's not really the case. There's a hierarchy and a continuum and certain criteria for prophecy, and only a small amount of the criteria has to do with foretelling. It's it's instead any spiritual experience that's described in the text. Moses burning bush, Jeremiah and the burning pot, Daniel and his rivers of fire. Um, Even inspiration, the Psalms were written in the spirit of prophecy. Strength, Samson, that was a prophetic experience. Uh, but if you look at the phenomenology of the visions and the voices and the psychedelic kinds of full blown stuff, if you compare the DMT and the prophetic state, they overlap strikingly with respect to their phenomenology. Uh, the visions, the voices. If you read the first chapter of Ezekiel, with the spinning wheels and the angels with eyes on their backs and the lightning and the roar, and Ezekiel falls down and he loses strength. The angel grabs him by the hair, takes him into outer space. Um, that sounds pretty DMT-like. So uh, it comported. It was more consistent with the results of my DMT study than the mystical unitive state. What is the tradition that devolves from an interactive relational spiritual experience? Um, it provides an alternative, to the mystical unitive Eastern religious, New Age structure. So to the extent that prophecy and DMT share phenomenology, there might be overlapping biology. In other words, is elevated brain DMT responsible for the visions of Ezekiel? So this is a bit. Oh, okay. So yeah, I condensed a lot of material uh, in this slide here. Um, if you want to learn more about the model, I wrote a book in 2014 called DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. And it both describes, why I started studying the Hebrew Bible as an alternative model, to Buddhism. And also it's a painstaking comparison of the two states. And I conclude that there's a lot of phenomenology overlap, the visions and the voices, but the content is strikingly uh, strikingly different. Uh, Prophecy, Jeremiah, the whole Hebrew Bible uh, has a lot of information in it, as opposed to the DMT state, about which the most one can say with any level of sophistication is it exists. This is what it looks like. This is the way it feels in my body, or the lack of body. These are the emotions. But the content wasn't all that striking. They were mostly resolution of personal issues, professional. Um, so that once again bespeaks the relevance of calling these drugs, psychedelic. Uh, their mind disclosing, mind manifesting. So the character of the prophet in the Bible is distinct from a research volunteer who is coming from a completely different place. And then I speculate about naturally occurring DMT playing a role in the visions, but not the intellectual cognitive content. There's a lot of interest in plants in the Hebrew Bible. Are there examples of people smoking things or eating things that could cause the visions? But there's not really. And the existence of naturally occurring DMT in the brain makes it really unnecessary to look for an exogenous source. So, back to the present day and age, there is a tsunami of interest in psychedelics. Once again, there's a huge amount of interest in capitalizing their effects in any number of models. Mostly the medicalization. depression, stroke, brain damage, any number of other conditions, other circumstances, wellness. So it's also the result of all of my peers who were in their 20s in the 1960s, coming to power. So there is a lot more interest and a lot more acceptance of the validity of the psychedelic experience. The media is much friendlier. There's decriminalization movements across the country, rescheduling movements, conferences, workshops, progressive causes. So I think it's important to not figure that it's game over, that things will just be perfect now for the psychedelic movement. On the contrary, there's Fox News. Don't forget them. And if anything goes bad with psychedelics, prepare for the backlash. Let's say there's a new Charles Manson who crawls out from under some rock and convinces his followers to become serial killers, and they point to LSD or psilocybin as catalyzing those thoughts and behaviors. And there are going to be adverse effects, especially in less controlled circumstances. Suicides, for example, psychosis that ends up in emergency rooms, psychiatric units, and jails. So we don't want to glorify the benefits. We want to be clear-eyed in talking about what's going on, what's curative, what are the mechanisms, and also we ought to be clear-eyed about the risks and the adverse effects. So if we've been sweeping or minimizing the adverse effects, and they start to crop up, the media is going to say, why didn't you tell us about these adverse effects? So I don't think you want to become a zealot. You want to, if you can anyway, in academics, maintain some rigor. So malignant uses would be Charles Manson and his ilk. Okay, so that's pretty much that. Let me take questions from the class, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture.
There are fields which are undiscovered so far, which have nothing to do with anything that is discovered so far. The gravitational field, was unknown before the year 1604. The electromagnetic field, unknown before the year 1830 or something. All of these, what we call the fundamental fields of mathematical physics, are new discoveries. Dark energy is also even newer discovery, and beyond that are maybe more discoveries yet coming beyond our cosmos itself, in higher dimensions, as they say.